A woman whispered in confession. I've been switching babies in the hospital where I work for 20 years. She named specific families in our congregation. My hands shook as I realized one of those babies was. My name is Father Michael O'Connor, and I've served the congregation of St. Mary's Catholic Church for 20 years. In that time, I've heard countless confessions, offered comfort to the grieving, and baptized 3 generations of families who call this sacred place home. I believed I had encountered every form of human struggle and sin that could walk through these doors. I was wrong. I was gathering the prayer books from the pews when I heard the heavy oak door creak open behind me. Turning, I saw Margaret Wilson stepping into the dim light of the sanctuary, her nurse's uniform still crisp, despite what must have been a long shift at Mercy General Hospital. Margaret had been a pillar of our community for over 2 decades, organizing charity drives and volunteering countless hours to help struggling families. She was the kind of woman who embodied the very spirit of Christian service. Father O'Connor, she called softly, her voice carrying an unusual tremor. Might I have a word with you? In the confessional? Something in her tone made my pastoral instincts sharpen. In 20 years of ministry, you learn to recognize when someone carries a burden heavier than the usual struggles of daily life. I nodded gently and made my way to the traditional wooden confessional booth that had served our parish since 1952. The confessional had always been my sacred sanctuary within a sanctuary. Here in the dim space separated only by an ornate screen, I had witnessed the raw honesty of human souls seeking redemption. Tonight felt different, though. As Margaret settled into her side of the booth, I could hear her breathing, shallow and rapid, like someone preparing to leap from a great height. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, she began, following the familiar ritual that had opened countless confessions before. But then she paused, and in that silence I felt something shift in the very air around us. Margaret, take your time, I said gently, drawing upon decades of experience in guiding troubled souls toward the light of truth. The Lord knows your heart before you speak, and His mercy is boundless. What came next shattered every foundation I thought I understood about the nature of sin and the complexity of human motivation. Father, she whispered, her voice barely audible through the screen. I've been switching babies at the hospital where I work for 20 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the magnitude of what she was saying began to register. 20 years, 2 decades of what exactly? I need you to understand, she continued, her voice gaining strength as if the act of confession was releasing something she had held imprisoned for far too long. I wasn't hurting these children, I was saving them. Some families, they're not equipped to raise children properly. They lack the resources, the stability, the moral foundation. But others have everything a child could need except the blessing of a baby. My hands trembled as I gripped the wooden armrest of my chair. As a priest, I had sworn to maintain the sacred seal of confession, to carry the secrets of troubled souls to my grave, if necessary. But as a human being, as a member of this community who had baptized children and counseled families, I felt a horrific understanding beginning to dawn. Margaret, I managed to say, my voice hoarse with shock, are you telling me you've been deliberately switching newborn babies between families? Yes, Father. And before you ask, yes, some of those families attend this very church. The Thompson's daughter, Sarah, she should have gone to the Rodriguez family. Little Timothy O'Brien, your godson, his biological parents are the Hendersons, who couldn't afford proper prenatal care. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Timothy O'Brien, my godson, the boy I had baptized 8 years ago, held in my arms as his parents promised before God to raise him in faith and love. The child who called me Uncle Mike and drew me pictures of angels with crooked wings. I kept detailed records, Margaret continued, seemingly oblivious to the earthquake she was creating in my soul. Every switch, every family. I can tell you exactly which children belong where. I've been careful, methodical. I did it out of love, Father, out of a desire to give every child the best possible chance at life. My mouth went dry as sand. Through the screen, I could see her silhouette, this woman I had known and respected for decades, calmly describing what amounted to systematic kidnapping performed under the guise of medical care. The contradiction between the Margaret I thought I knew and the woman confessing to me now was so stark that I wondered if I was experiencing some kind of nightmare. "Father, are you there?" she asked when I remained silent, struggling to process the implications of her confession. "Yes, Margaret," I replied, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "I'm here." But even as I spoke those words, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The sacred seal of confession meant that I could never reveal what I had just learned. Yet sitting in the darkness of that confessional booth, I understood that Margaret Wilson had just placed an impossible burden on my shoulders. As she continued to speak, detailing her methods and justifications, my mind raced with the faces of the families she had mentioned. Good people, faithful people, parents who loved children they believed were their own biological offspring, never suspecting that their family's foundation was built upon a lie, carefully crafted by a woman they trusted with their most precious moments. When Margaret finally finished her confession and left the booth, I remained seated in the darkness, my hands shaking as I clutched my rosary. Outside, the autumn rain continued to fall, but inside the confessional, I felt as though I was drowning in a sea of impossible choices. How do you carry the weight of such knowledge? How do you look into the eyes of Timothy O'Brien's parents on Sunday morning, knowing what you know? How do you maintain the sacred trust of confession while innocent families live their lives built upon deception? As I finally emerged from the confessional and locked the church doors behind me, I realized that my real test of faith was only just beginning. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I found myself walking the halls of the rectory, my footsteps echoing in the silence as Margaret's confession replayed in my mind like a broken record. 20 years, 2 decades of systematically switching newborn babies, and I was the only person on earth who knew the truth. I made my way to my study, where the walls were lined with theological texts that had guided me through countless pastoral challenges over the years. But tonight, even the wisdom of centuries felt inadequate against the weight of what I now carried. I pulled down my worn copy of Scripture and let it fall open, seeking divine guidance as I had done so many times before. "The truth will set you free," I read from John's Gospel. But the words felt like a mockery. What truth? The truth that would destroy families? The truth that would shatter the foundation of children's identities? I closed the book and stared out the window at the church where I had served for 2 decades, where I had baptized Timothy O'Brien just 8 years ago. Timothy, my godson, the boy with sandy hair and bright blue eyes who reminded me so much of his father, Patrick. Or so I had always thought. Now I wondered if those eyes actually belonged to the Henderson family bloodline, and if the Henderson struggles with infertility had been resolved through Margaret's twisted sense of divine intervention. I remember the day I baptized Timothy like it was yesterday. Patrick and Mary O'Brien had tried for years to conceive, spending their savings on fertility treatments and filling my office with tears of disappointment month after month. When Mary finally became pregnant, it felt like a miracle-answered prayer. The entire congregation celebrated with them. Standing at the baptismal font that sunny Sunday morning, holding their precious baby as the holy water flowed over his tiny forehead, I had felt the profound joy of participating in God's plan. "Timothy Patrick O'Brien," I had proclaimed, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." The congregation had burst into applause, and Patrick had wept openly as his son was welcomed into the body of Christ. Now I wondered if everything about that sacred moment had been built upon a lie. Margaret Wilson had been there that day, I remembered. She had stood in the front pew, smiling warmly as she watched me perform the sacrament. She had brought a beautiful handmade blanket for the baby and had volunteered to help with the reception afterward. Everyone in the parish respected Margaret. She was the woman who organized our annual food drives, who visited sick parishioners in the hospital, who never missed a Sunday service in over 20 years. That was what made her confession so devastating. This wasn't some stranger confessing to terrible crimes. This was Margaret Wilson, a pillar of our community, a woman I had trusted implicitly, a woman who had apparently been playing God with the lives of newborn babies for my entire tenure at St. Mary's. I tried to understand her motivations, to find some thread of compassion that might help me process what she had done. Margaret had lost her own baby during childbirth 25 years ago. Her husband had left her shortly after, unable to cope with the grief. She had poured herself into her work at the hospital and her service to the church, becoming the kind of person everyone turned to in times of need. Perhaps, In her broken understanding, she had convinced herself that she was correcting injustices. She had mentioned the Rodriguez family during her confession. I knew them well, young immigrants who worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Their son, Miguel, had always seemed remarkably bright, with an intuitive understanding of music that neither parent possessed. Had Margaret looked at their circumstances and decided that baby belonged elsewhere? And the Thompsons, successful professionals who had everything money could buy except the child they desperately wanted. Their daughter, Sarah, was now 12, a brilliant student who excelled at everything she attempted. Had Margaret seen their wealth and stability and decided they deserved a baby more than whoever Sarah's biological parents might have been? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Margaret had created her own twisted theology. She had appointed herself as an instrument of divine justice, redistributing babies according to her personal judgments about which families were worthy. In her mind, she probably believed she was doing God's work, but that understanding brought me no peace. If anything, it made the situation more tragic. Margaret wasn't a monster driven by greed or malice. She was a broken woman whose grief had warped her sense of right and wrong until she could commit these acts while maintaining her faith and her position in our community. I spent the remaining hours before dawn in the sanctuary, kneeling before the crucifix that had watched over St. Mary's for over a century. The familiar space usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. Even the eternal flame that burned near the altar seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Lord, I prayed, show me what you would have me do. I am bound by sacred vows to protect the seal of confession, but innocent families are living in deception. Children are growing up not knowing their true heritage. How can I serve both justice and mercy? But the only answer was silence. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows, I thought about the families Margaret had named. The O'Briens, who had found such joy in their son Timothy, the Rodriguez family, who worked so hard to provide for Miguel, the Thompsons, who had poured their love into Sarah, all of them innocent victims of Margaret's misguided interventions. And then there were the families she hadn't named. How many others were there? How many children in our parish might be living with families that weren't biologically their own? The scope of the deception was staggering, and I was the only person who knew the truth. I found myself thinking of King Solomon's wisdom when two women claimed the same baby. But this situation was far more complex than that ancient tale. Here the babies had been deliberately placed with families who believed they were the biological parents. Revealing the truth wouldn't just solve the problem, it would create dozens of new tragedies. As I prepared for the morning mass, I wondered how I would face these families. How could I look Patrick O'Brien in the eye, knowing what I knew about Timothy? How could I offer communion to the Rodriguez family or the Thompsons without my hands trembling with the weight of Margaret's secret? The early morning parishioners began arriving for the 7 o'clock service, their faces familiar and trusting. Mrs. Henderson, who had struggled with infertility for years and eventually adopted. Mr. Rodriguez, stopping by before his shift at the factory, these good people had placed their faith in me to guide them spiritually. And now I carried knowledge that could shatter their worlds. As I vested for Mass, putting on the sacred garments that symbolize my role as shepherd of this flock, I realized that Margaret's confession had changed everything. The foundation of trust that held our community together had been built on lies I was now sworn to protect. Standing at the altar that morning, looking out at the congregation that had become my family over 2 decades of service, I understood that I was facing the greatest test of my priesthood. The sacred seal of confession was inviolable, but so was my duty to protect the innocent. Somewhere in that balance between divine law and human compassion, I would have to find a way forward that honored both my vows and my conscience. But as I began the ancient words of the Mass, I had no idea how such a path could possibly exist. The following Sunday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the coldness that had settled in my heart. As I prepared for the 10 o'clock service, I found myself dreading what had always been the highlight of my week. How could I stand before my congregation and preach about truth and righteousness when I harbored knowledge that could destroy the very foundation of their families? The sanctuary filled with familiar faces, but now I saw them through a completely different lens. There was Patrick O'Brien, sitting in the third pew with his arm around Mary, while 8-year-old Timothy colored quietly in a children's bulletin beside them. The boy's sandy hair caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass, and I found myself studying his features with new eyes. Timothy had always been different from his parents in subtle ways. Patrick was stocky and dark-haired, while Mary was petite with brown eyes. Timothy was tall for his age, with those striking blue eyes and an athletic build that seemed to come from nowhere in the O'Brien family tree. We had always attributed it to distant relatives or recessive genes, the way families do when trying to explain the beautiful mysteries of heredity. Now I wondered if those blue eyes belonged to the Henderson family, sitting 2 rows behind them. Robert and Janet Henderson had struggled with infertility for years before finally adopting twin girls from overseas. I studied Robert's profile and felt my stomach lurch. The resemblance was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. 3 rows ahead, the Rodriguez family sat together as they did every Sunday. Miguel, now 16, was helping his younger sister with her Sunday school worksheet. The boy had always impressed me with his musical abilities and his quick grasp of complex theological concepts during confirmation classes. His parents, hardworking immigrants who spoke broken English, had often marveled at their son's gifts. "Father, Miguel is so smart," his mother had told me just last month. "Sometimes I wonder where he gets this brain. God has blessed us so much, even though we cannot give him all the opportunities we wish we could." Looking at Miguel now, I noticed features that didn't quite match his parents. His bone structure was more angular, his height unusual for his family line. During confession, Margaret had mentioned that Miguel should have gone to the Rodriguez family. The implication was becoming horrifyingly clear. As I began the opening prayers, I spotted Margaret herself in her usual seat in the 5th row. She appeared completely normal, participating in the responses with the same devotion she had shown for 20 years. How could someone carry such massive deception while maintaining this facade of faith? Yet there she was, singing hymns and bowing her head in prayer, as if nothing had changed. During the scripture reading, I found myself focusing on families I had never scrutinized before. The Johnsons with their adopted son Marcus, who bore an uncanny resemblance to the Williams family. The elderly Kowalskis, whose late-in-life miracle baby had grown into a daughter who looked nothing like either parent. How many families in this very sanctuary were built on Margaret's twisted interventions? My sermon that morning was supposed to focus on the parable of the Good Samaritan. But as I looked out at the congregation, different words came tumbling out of my mouth. "Truth," I heard myself saying, "is the foundation upon which all relationships are built." When we live in deception, even with good intentions, we rob others of their right to make informed choices about their lives. I saw Margaret shift uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes meeting mine briefly before looking away. Several parishioners nodded thoughtfully, but they had no idea I was speaking directly about the crisis that was tearing my soul apart. "Sometimes," I continued, feeling the weight of every word, "we convince ourselves that our small lies protect others from pain. But truth has a way of surfacing, and when it does, the damage is often far greater than if we had been honest from the beginning." After the service, the usual crowd gathered for coffee and fellowship in the parish hall. I forced myself to circulate among the families, but every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. "Father Mike!" Timothy O'Brien ran up to me with a drawing he had made during the service. "Look, I drew you giving communion." The picture showed a stick-figure priest at an oversized altar surrounded by happy families. In a child's simple artwork, he had captured the joy and community that made St. Mary special. Looking at his bright, trusting face, I felt physically ill. "That's beautiful, Timothy," I managed to say, ruffling his hair. "You're getting to be quite the artist." "Mom says I get it from great Uncle Frank," Timothy said proudly. "He painted pictures of ships." But even as he spoke, I was wondering if his artistic talents actually came from whatever family he truly belonged to. How many of his characteristics had the O'Briens attributed to distant relatives or lucky genetics, never knowing the truth about their son's origins? Later that afternoon, I was returning from a hospital visit when I encountered Janet Henderson at the grocery store. She looked exhausted, pushing a cart while trying to manage her adopted twins, now 10 years old. "Father O'Connor," she called out, seeming grateful for a friendly face. "How are you holding up? You look tired." "Just the usual parish duties," I replied, though I knew my face probably reflected the sleepless nights I had been enduring. "How are the girls adjusting?" Oh, they're doing wonderfully, Janet said, but there was a strain in her voice. Though I have to admit, Robert and I have been talking about what it might have been like if we could have had biological children. The twins are blessings, absolutely, but sometimes you wonder about genetics and family traits and all that. The irony of her words hit me like a physical blow. Here was a woman wondering about the biological children she never had, while somewhere in our parish her actual biological son was growing up with a different family, completely unaware of his true heritage. God's plan isn't always clear to us, I said carefully, but every child is placed exactly where they need to be. Even as I spoke the words, I wondered if I believed them anymore. Had God's plan included Margaret's interventions, or had her actions disrupted the divine order in ways I couldn't even comprehend? That evening, I found myself walking through the church after hours, something that had become a habit since Margaret's confession. The familiar space that had always been my refuge now felt heavy with secrets and moral complexity. I knelt before the tabernacle where the Blessed Sacrament was reserved and tried to pray for guidance, but my mind kept returning to the faces I had seen that morning. Timothy's trusting smile, Miguel's quiet intelligence, the Henderson family's longing for biological children they might actually have. Lord, I whispered into the silence, how many families are affected? How many children are growing up not knowing their true identity? And how can I serve you faithfully while carrying this knowledge that could destroy so many lives? The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. I had always prided myself on being available to my parishioners, on offering counsel and comfort in their times of need. But now I felt like a fraud, sitting across from families while harboring information that fundamentally changed everything about their relationships. During my evening prayers, I found myself drawn to the story of Jonah, the prophet who tried to run from God's calling because the task seemed too difficult. But there was no ship I could board to escape this responsibility. Margaret's confession had made me a reluctant keeper of truths that belonged to families throughout our parish. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that the situation was far worse than I had initially understood. This wasn't just about 3 families mentioned in a confession. This was about a systematic pattern of deception that had touched countless lives over 2 decades. Margaret Wilson had been present at virtually every birth in our parish for the past 20 years. She had the access, the opportunity, and clearly the misguided motivation to have made switches, far beyond what she had specifically confessed to me. Looking at my calendar for the coming week, I saw appointments with several of the families that were now under suspicion. How could I offer pastoral care and spiritual guidance while knowing that their entire family structure might be built on lies? The sacred seal of confession bound me to silence, but my pastoral duty demanded that I protect the innocent members of my flock. I was trapped between 2 sacred obligations that seemed impossible to reconcile. As I turned off the lights and tried once again to sleep, I knew that tomorrow would bring only more painful observations and impossible choices. The burden Margaret had placed on my shoulders was growing heavier with each passing day, and I had no idea how much longer I could carry it alone. 3 weeks after Margaret's confession, the crisis I had been dreading finally arrived in the form of a desperate phone call at 6 in the morning. "Father O'Connor?" The voice on the other end was thick with tears and barely controlled panic. "This is Maria Rodriguez. Please, we need your help. Miguel is in the hospital and the doctors are saying terrible things about his blood. They want to test Carlos and me, but the results, Father, they don't make sense." My hands trembled as I gripped the phone. Miguel Rodriguez, the bright 16-year-old who had always impressed me with his intelligence and musical gifts, was facing a medical crisis that would inevitably reveal the truth about his parentage. "I'll be right there, Maria," I said, my voice hoarse with the weight of what I knew was coming. "Which hospital?" "Mercy General, the same place where he was born. Father, I'm scared. The doctors keep asking questions about our family medical history, but Miguel has some rare blood condition that neither Carlos nor I carry. They think maybe there was some mistake in the records." Mercy General, Margaret's hospital, the place where all of this had begun. I dressed quickly and drove through the pre-dawn darkness, my mind racing with the implications. Miguel needed a blood transfusion for emergency surgery, but his rare blood type wasn't compatible with either of his parents. The medical team would inevitably discover that Carlos and Maria Rodriguez were not Miguel's biological parents. When I arrived at the hospital, I found the Rodriguez family huddled together in the surgical waiting room. Carlos sat with his head in his hands while Maria clutched a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. Their younger daughter, Sophia, leaned against her mother, confused and frightened by the adult crisis unfolding around her. "Father, thank God you're here," Maria said, rising to embrace me. "The doctors say Miguel needs surgery immediately, but they need a blood donor with his exact type. They tested Carlos and me, but we're not matches." "How is that possible? They're talking about doing more tests, saying there might have been some error when Miguel was born." I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong word would send this family tumbling into an abyss of shattered identity and broken trust. Yet I was bound by sacred vows to remain silent about what I knew. "Sometimes medical situations bring up questions that are difficult to answer," I said carefully. "What matters most right now is Miguel's health. Are the doctors searching for compatible donors?" "Yes, but it's a very rare type." Carlos spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "Father, I keep thinking about what you said in your sermon last week, about truth being the foundation of relationships. Do you think God is trying to tell us something?" The irony of his words hit me like a physical blow. Here was a man whose faith was leading him toward a truth that would devastate his family, while I sat beside him, harboring the very knowledge that could answer his questions. Dr. Patricia Webb, the attending physician, approached our group with a clipboard and a grave expression. I recognized her as an occasional visitor to our parish, though she wasn't a regular member. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez," she said gently, "we found compatible donors for Miguel, so the immediate medical crisis is resolved. However, the blood tests have raised some questions that we need to address. The genetic markers suggest that Miguel may not be your biological son. I recommend genetic counseling to help you understand what this means." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria's rosary clattered to the floor as her hands went to her mouth in shock. Carlos stared at the doctor as if she were speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible," Maria whispered. "I gave birth to Miguel. I remember everything about that day. He was placed in my arms by the nurse." "By which nurse?" Dr. Webb asked, making notes on her clipboard. "Margaret Wilson," Carlos answered immediately. "She was wonderful to us. She stayed with Maria through the whole delivery and made sure Miguel was healthy before bringing him to us. She said he was perfect." I watched Dr. Webb's expression change slightly at the mention of Margaret's name, and I wondered if she was beginning to connect pieces of a puzzle that extended far beyond this single family. After Dr. Webb left to prepare for Miguel's surgery, I found myself alone with the shattered Rodriguez family. Maria was crying quietly, while Carlos struggled to process what they had just learned. "Father," Carlos said, his voice breaking, "if Miguel isn't our son, then where is our real child? And who are his real parents? How could this happen?" I felt the weight of Margaret's confession pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew exactly how this had happened. I knew that their biological son was probably living with another family in our parish, just as Miguel had been living with them. But I was bound by sacred vows to carry that knowledge in silence. "Sometimes God's plan unfolds in ways we don't understand," I said, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "What matters is that you've loved Miguel as your son for 16 years. That love doesn't change because of genetics." But even as I spoke, I could see the devastation in their eyes. Their entire understanding of their family had been shattered in a single conversation with a doctor. Over the next several hours, as Miguel underwent successful surgery, I stayed with the family and watched their world quietly collapse. They called relatives to share the shocking news. They struggled to understand how such a mistake could have happened. They worried about Miguel's reaction when he recovered enough to learn the truth. Later that afternoon, I encountered Margaret Wilson in the hospital corridor. She was coming off her shift, still wearing scrubs, and when she saw me, her face went pale. "Father O'Connor," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I heard about the Rodriguez boy. Terrible situation. These genetic mysteries can be so confusing for families." Her casual dismissal of the crisis she had created made my anger flare for the first time since her confession. "Margaret," I said quietly, "we need to talk. This family is being destroyed by questions that you could answer." "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Father," she replied, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "I hope you're not suggesting that I should violate patient confidentiality or hospital protocols by speculating about genetic test results. I'm suggesting that you have a moral obligation to consider the pain you've caused," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "I think you're overstepping your bounds," Margaret replied, her tone becoming defensive. "My work at this hospital has always been exemplary. If you continue to make these veiled accusations, I'll have to consider whether St. Mary's is the right parish for my family." The threat was clear. If I pushed too hard, she would leave the parish, taking her secrets with her, and leaving even more families in permanent uncertainty about their children's true identities. That evening, I drove to the diocesan office to meet with Bishop Matthews, a wise man who had guided me through difficult pastoral situations before. I had called ahead, asking for an urgent consultation about the boundaries of confessional confidentiality. "Michael," the bishop said as we sat in his private office, "you look like a man carrying the weight of the world. What's troubling you?" I chose my words carefully, desperate for guidance while respecting the sacred seal that bound me. "Your Excellence, if someone confessed to crimes that are ongoing, that continue to harm innocent people, what are the limits of our obligation to maintain silence?" Bishop Matthews studied my face with the perception that came from decades of pastoral experience. "The seal of confession is absolute," he said slowly. "But if you have knowledge of ongoing harm to children or vulnerable people, there may be ways to address the situation without technically violating the confessional. Can you tell me more about the nature of the harm?" "Families are living in deception about their most fundamental relationships," I said carefully. "Children don't know their true identity. Parents have been robbed of their biological children and given someone else's. And the person responsible continues to work in a position where they could repeat these crimes." The bishop was quiet for a long moment, clearly understanding the magnitude of what I was describing, without my having to break the seal of confession. "Pray for divine guidance," he said finally. "Sometimes God provides ways for truth to emerge that don't require us to violate our sacred vows. But Michael, if children are in immediate danger, the protection of innocence must take precedence over all other considerations." As I drove home that night, I realized that I was rapidly approaching a point where I would have to choose between competing sacred duties. The Rodriguez family was already shattered, and I suspected they were only the beginning. How many more families would face similar crises before this situation resolved itself? Looking up at the stars through my windshield, I offered a desperate prayer for wisdom, strength, and divine intervention. Because I was beginning to understand that human solutions to this crisis might require sacrifices that would test the very foundation of my faith. The breaking point came exactly 1 week after Miguel Rodriguez's surgery, when I received a call that made my blood run cold. Father O'Connor, the voice belonged to Sarah Chen, a young parishioner who was 8 months pregnant with her first child. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm really scared. I'm scheduled for delivery at Mercy General next week, and after hearing about what happened to the Rodriguez family, I'm worried about the hospital procedures. Can we meet to talk?" My hands began shaking as I held the phone. Another innocent family, another potential victim. Margaret Wilson was still working at Mercy General, still in a position to repeat her crimes, and I was the only person who knew the truth. "Of course, Sarah," I managed to say. "When would you like to meet?" "Actually, I'm at the hospital right now for a checkup. Could you possibly come here? I know it's a lot to ask, but my husband is deployed overseas, and I don't have anyone else to talk to." Within 30 minutes, I was walking through the corridors of Mercy General, the same halls where Margaret had spent 20 years playing God with newborn babies. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was potentially watching her prepare to claim another victim while being bound by sacred vows to remain silent. I found Sarah in the maternity ward waiting room, her hands protectively covering her swollen belly. She looked young and vulnerable, exactly the type of patient that Margaret might target for her twisted interventions. "Father, thank you for coming," Sarah said, tears already forming in her eyes. "I keep thinking about Miguel Rodriguez and how his whole family was torn apart by what happened here. What if something similar happens to my baby? What if there's some mistake and I don't get my real child? Sarah, I said gently, what specifically are you worried about? Well, my husband David is Asian American and I'm Caucasian. Our baby is going to have very distinctive features. But what if someone decides that another family would be better for a mixed-race child? What if there are people here who think they know better than God about where babies should go? Her words hit me like lightning. Sarah had unknowingly identified exactly the kind of reasoning that had driven Margaret's actions for 2 decades. The thought that another innocent family might be targeted while I sat powerless was becoming unbearable. Have you met the nursing staff who will be assisting with your delivery? I asked carefully. Yes, the head nurse is Margaret Wilson. She seems very nice, very professional. She's been working here forever, apparently. She told me not to worry about anything, that she would make sure everything went perfectly. I felt the world tilt around me. Margaret had already made contact with Sarah Chen. The pattern was repeating itself exactly as it had with countless other families over the past 20 years. After spending an hour trying to comfort Sarah without revealing what I knew, I left the hospital feeling like I was drowning in moral quicksand. Every step I took seemed to make the situation worse, yet I could see no path forward that didn't require betraying either my sacred vows or innocent families. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor at the rectory. Dr. Patricia Webb, the physician who had treated Miguel Rodriguez, stood at my door with a manila folder in her hands. "Father O'Connor," she said, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I need to discuss something with you in confidence. The Rodriguez case has prompted me to review some unusual patterns in our maternity ward, and I'm concerned about what I've discovered." I invited her into my study, my heart pounding with the realization that external forces were beginning to investigate Margaret's activities. "I've been looking at genetic discrepancies in families over the past 20 years, Dr. Webb continued, and there are far more cases than statistical probability would suggest. All of them involve deliveries where Margaret Wilson was the attending nurse. I'm preparing to take this information to the hospital administration and possibly law enforcement." "That's very thorough of you," I said carefully, trying to hide my relief that the truth might emerge through channels that didn't require me to break the seal of confession. "Father, I know you've been counseling several of the affected families. Have any of them mentioned anything that might help with this investigation? Any irregularities they noticed at the time of delivery?" I chose my words carefully. Many families have expressed confusion about genetic traits that don't seem to match family history, but that's not unusual in itself. Dr. Webb nodded, but I could see she was hoping for more specific information. "There's something else, Father. I've learned that Margaret Wilson has requested to be assigned to Sarah Chen's delivery next week. Given what I am beginning to suspect about Margaret's activities, I'm very concerned about this assignment." The confirmation of my worst fears hit me like a physical blow. Margaret was indeed positioning herself to potentially victimize another family, and I was the only person who could prevent it with certainty. "What are you planning to do?" I asked. "I'm meeting with the hospital administration tomorrow morning to present my findings, but these investigations can take time, and Mrs. Chen's baby is due very soon. I'm worried that if there is ongoing criminal activity, we might not be able to stop it in time." After Dr. Webb left, I spent the night in the sanctuary, kneeling before the altar in the most intense prayer of my life. The eternal flame flickered in the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls as I wrestled with the greatest moral crisis of my priesthood. "Lord," I prayed desperately, "show me the way. If I maintain the seal of confession, Sarah Chen's baby may become Margaret's next victim. But if I break my sacred vows, how can I continue to serve as your priest? How can I be trusted with the souls you've placed in my care?" As the hours passed, I found myself drawn to the story of Moses, who was called to confront Pharaoh despite his own reluctance and imperfections. I thought of Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers, choosing righteous anger over passive acceptance of corruption. I remembered the parable of the Good Samaritan, where mercy and action triumphed over religious protocol. Somewhere in the darkest hour before dawn, I experienced what I can only describe as a moment of divine clarity. The words of Jesus echoed in my mind. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The sacred laws existed to serve human flourishing, not to enable ongoing harm to innocent people. I understood with sudden, crystal-clear certainty that my highest calling as a priest wasn't to protect institutional rules, but to protect the vulnerable people God had entrusted to my care. The seal of confession was sacred, but it couldn't be used as a shield for ongoing crimes against children and families. As the first light of dawn began filtering through the stained glass windows, I made my decision. I would confront Margaret one final time, giving her the opportunity to confess voluntarily before Dr. Webb's investigation reached its conclusion. If she refused, I would find a way to ensure that Sarah Chen's baby was protected, even if it cost me my priesthood. Standing before the crucifix that had watched over St. Mary's for generations, I offered one final prayer. Lord, if I'm wrong about this path, I trust in your mercy to forgive me, but I cannot stand by and watch another innocent family be victimized while I have the power to prevent it. The next morning, I called Margaret Wilson and asked her to meet me at the church immediately. There was an urgency in my voice that she couldn't ignore. Margaret, I said when she arrived, Dr. Webb is presenting evidence to the hospital administration this morning about genetic irregularities in the maternity ward. This is your last chance to confess voluntarily before the truth comes out through other means. Her face went pale, but her response was defiant. I don't know what you're talking about, Father, and I think you're getting dangerously close to violating the trust that people place in you. Sarah Chen's baby will not become your next victim, I said quietly. I won't allow it. Margaret's eyes blazed with anger and desperation. You have no right to interfere with my work, and if you break the seal of confession, your career as a priest is over. Who will believe you then? Looking into her face, I saw not the faithful parishioner I had known for 20 years, but a woman whose grief had transformed into something twisted and destructive. In that moment, I knew that my choice was not between competing sacred duties, but between protecting the innocent and enabling evil. My priesthood is in God's hands, I replied, but those children's lives are in mine. As Margaret stormed out of the church, I knew that within hours, everything would change. The truth would emerge, the families would learn about their children's real identities, and I would face the consequences of my choices. But for the first time in weeks, I felt peace. I had chosen to protect the innocent, trusting that God would judge my heart rather than my adherence to rules that had been corrupted by human evil. The truth erupted into the open on a Tuesday morning, not through my intervention, but through what I could only recognize as divine providence working through human hands. Dr. Webb's presentation to the hospital administration had triggered an immediate internal investigation. When security cameras were reviewed, they discovered Margaret Wilson accessing patient files after hours, cross-referencing birth records with family information that had no medical relevance. The pattern of her activities over 20 years painted a clear picture of systematic manipulation. By noon, the police were at Mercy General with a search warrant. They found Margaret's detailed records hidden in her office, a comprehensive log of every baby switch she had orchestrated, complete with the names of both biological and adoptive families, along with her personal justifications for each decision. The phone in my rectory began ringing at 1:30 p.m. and didn't stop for the next 6 hours. Father O'Connor, this is Detective Sarah Morrison with the City Police. We need to speak with you about Margaret Wilson and several families in your parish. Can you meet us at the station? Then came the calls from my parishioners. Patrick O'Brien's voice was shaking with disbelief. Father, the police just left our house. They're saying Timothy might not be our biological son. They mentioned other families, said there's been some kind of investigation. Please tell me this is some terrible mistake. Maria Rodriguez called in tears. Father, they've arrested that nurse, Margaret Wilson. The police say she admitted to switching babies, including Miguel. They want us to come to the station to give statements. How could this have happened? How could someone do this to families? By evening, the story had broken on local news channels. The scandal of a trusted hospital nurse systematically switching newborn babies over 2 decades sent shockwaves through our entire community. The phone lines at St. Mary's were overwhelmed with calls from families who had delivered babies at Mercy General, all desperately wanting to know if their children were affected. I spent that first night driving between the homes of parishioners whose worlds had been shattered by the day's revelations. At the O'Brien house, I found Patrick and Mary sitting at their kitchen table with Timothy between them, holding hands as they tried to process the incomprehensible news. Father, Timothy said, his 8-year-old voice filled with confusion, Mom and Dad say I might have different parents who miss me. But I don't want different parents. I want to stay with Mom and Dad. Mary was crying quietly while Patrick struggled to maintain composure for his son's sake. The police gave us a name, Patrick said. Robert and Janet Henderson. They say those might be Timothy's biological parents, but Timothy is our son. We've raised him, loved him, been there for every moment of his life. How do we even begin to sort this out? At the Rodriguez home, I found a similar scene of bewildered grief. Carlos was pacing the living room while Maria sat with Miguel, who had been discharged from the hospital just days earlier. The police told us our biological son is probably living with the Thompson family, Carlos said. A boy named Marcus Thompson, who's now 16, just like Miguel. They want us to meet them tomorrow to discuss DNA testing and what happens next. Father, how do you tell a 16-year-old boy that everything he knows about his identity might be wrong? Miguel, mature beyond his years as he had always been, spoke up quietly. I heard what happened, Father. If I'm not really their son, does that mean they don't have to love me anymore? The raw pain in these family conversations was unlike anything I had experienced in 20 years of pastoral counseling. These weren't deaths or divorces or financial crises. These were fundamental questions about identity, belonging, and the very nature of family bonds. At the police station the next day, I met with Detective Morrison to provide what assistance I could without violating any remaining confidentialities. Margaret had apparently provided a complete confession once confronted with the evidence, detailing her methods and motivations with the same methodical precision she had used to commit the crimes. She kept saying she was helping the children, Detective Morrison told me. She genuinely believed she was matching babies with families who could provide better opportunities. In her mind, she was correcting injustices rather than creating them. The detective handed me a list of affected families. 18 children over 20 years, ranging in age from infants to young adults. Some were families I knew well from our parish, others were names I recognized from the broader community. We're going to need help with the family meetings, Detective Morrison continued. These people are going to need counseling, spiritual guidance, and support as they navigate genetic testing and decide what relationships they want to maintain going forward. Would you be willing to coordinate with our Family Services Department? That evening, I called an emergency meeting at St. Mary's for all affected families. The parish hall filled with people I had known for years, but the atmosphere was unlike any gathering we had ever held. Fear, anger, confusion, and heartbreak permeated the room as families sat in small clusters, unsure how to relate to one another. I stood before them, feeling the weight of my role as their spiritual shepherd in this unprecedented crisis. Friends, I began, we are gathered tonight in circumstances none of us could have imagined. The foundation of trust we built our community upon has been shaken by the actions of someone we all respected and trusted. But I want you to know that the love you have shared as families, the bonds you have formed with your children, the memories you have created together, none of that changes because of genetics. Robert Henderson raised his hand tentatively. Father, we lost our biological son 18 years ago and never knew it. We adopted twin daughters and loved them completely, but now we discover we have a biological son who's been living 20 minutes away from us his entire life. How do we even begin to process that? From across the room, Patrick O'Brien responded, Timothy is our son. We've raised him, been there for his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. The fact that he might share your DNA doesn't change 8 years of being his parents. The tension in the room was palpable, but I could also see something else beginning to emerge, a recognition that they were all victims of the same crime, all facing impossible choices about how to move forward. What we need to remember, I continued, is that love creates family as much as biology does. Over the coming weeks and months, you'll all face difficult decisions about relationships, legal questions, and practical matters. But tonight, I want us to focus on one truth. Every child in this situation has been surrounded by love, whether from their biological families or the families who raised them. Margaret Wilson sat in the back of the room, having been released on bail pending trial. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the chaos she had created. Many families avoided eye contact with her, but I noticed that Maria Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement when Margaret looked her way. A small gesture of recognition that even in the midst of betrayal, the human capacity for grace could still emerge. As the meeting concluded, I announced that we would be establishing support groups for affected families, coordinating with genetic counselors and family therapists, and creating a process for families to meet and communicate if they chose to do so. The Hendersons and O'Briens approached each other hesitantly after most families had left. Robert Henderson extended his hand to Patrick O'Brien, and I watched as two men who shared a biological son tried to navigate the most complex introduction of their lives. "We don't want to disrupt Timothy's life," Robert said quietly, "but we'd like to get to know him, if that's something you'd be open to discussing." Patrick gripped Robert's hand firmly. "Timothy is going to need time to understand all of this, but maybe we can figure out a way for him to know both families who love him." As I locked the church that night and walked through the parish hall, where folding chairs still held the imprint of our extraordinary gathering, I realized that while the crisis was far from over, something hopeful was beginning to emerge from the devastation. The truth had finally set people free, even though the freedom came with more questions than answers. But for the first time since Margaret's confession, I felt that we were moving toward healing rather than deeper into chaos. 1 year later, I stood before the altar of St. Mary's, preparing for what would become the most meaningful baptism of my priesthood. The sanctuary was filled to capacity with familiar faces, but the congregation looked different now, stronger somehow, bound together by shared trials and the grace that had carried us through them. In the front pew sat an extraordinary gathering, the Henderson and O'Brien family side by side, with 9-year-old Timothy nestled comfortably between all 4 adults who had come to love him. The boy now spent weekends with his biological parents while maintaining his primary home with Patrick and Mary, the parents who had raised him. What could have been a custody battle had become a celebration of expanded family love. Behind them, Carlos and Maria Rodriguez sat with their son Miguel, now 17 and serving as a youth leader in our parish. Next to them were David and Linda Thompson with Marcus, the boy who shared Miguel's DNA but had grown into his own unique person through 16 years of love and guidance. The two boys had become close friends, bonding over their shared experience of discovering that family is created by choice as much as by biology. The baby I was preparing to baptize belonged to Sarah and David Chen, who had safely delivered their daughter at a different hospital 6 months earlier. Little Grace Chen gurgled happily in her baptismal gown, completely unaware that her peaceful arrival had marked the end of 20 years of deception at Mercy General Hospital. Margaret Wilson sat in the back pew as she had every Sunday for the past year. Her plea bargain had resulted in 2 years of community service rather than prison time, much of it spent volunteering with organizations that supported adoptive families. The transformation I had witnessed in her over these months had been profound. Not the broken woman who had confessed to me that terrible night, but someone who had found genuine redemption through facing the consequences of her actions. As I began the ancient ritual of baptism, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The past year had not been easy. There had been painful family meetings, complicated legal proceedings, and difficult conversations about identity and belonging. Some families had struggled more than others to find their way forward. The hardest situation had involved the Johnson family, whose adopted son Marcus bore such a strong resemblance to the Williams family that DNA testing had been almost unnecessary. The Williams family, devastated to learn they had spent 18 years grieving a son who was alive and well, had initially wanted to reclaim their biological child. But Marcus, now a college freshman, had chosen to maintain his relationship with the family who raised him while building new connections with his biological parents. It had taken months of family counseling and pastoral guidance to help all parties accept this decision. "Grace Elizabeth Chen," I proclaimed, pouring the holy water over the baby's forehead, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." As the congregation responded with "Amen," I saw tears of joy on many faces. This simple ceremony had taken on deeper meaning for our community, a reminder that every child is welcomed into God's family, regardless of the complexities of their earthly origins. During my homily, I spoke about the lessons our parish had learned through this trial. "A year ago," I began, "our community was shaken by revelations that challenged everything we thought we knew about family and trust. We discovered that 18 children in our parish had been living with families other than their biological parents, the result of one person's misguided attempts to play God with innocent lives." I paused, looking out at the faces that had become so dear to me through our shared suffering and healing. But in that darkness, we also discovered profound truths about the nature of love and family. We learned that biological connections, while important, are not the only bonds that matter. We saw parents make room in their hearts for additional children, and children discover they could love multiple sets of parents without diminishing any of those relationships. Timothy O'Brien raised his hand slightly and waved at me from the front pew, a gesture that had become our little tradition during services. Four adults smiled proudly at his small act of connection, no longer worried about who had the right to claim his affection. Most importantly, I continued, we learned about forgiveness. Not the easy forgiveness we offer when someone accidentally hurts us, but the costly grace required when someone deliberately damages our lives. We watched families choose healing over hatred, unity over division. After the service, the traditional reception took on the atmosphere of a family reunion. Children who had discovered they shared biological connections played together while their parents navigated relationships that had no precedent in their experience. The Rodriguez and Thompson families had become particularly close, with their sons often joking about being genetic twins who happened to live in different houses. Margaret Wilson approached me as the reception was winding down, her face reflecting the peace that had gradually replaced the torment I had seen in her during those first dark weeks. "Father," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to make this right, not just legally, but spiritually. Working with these families over the past year, seeing how they've chosen to forgive and rebuild, it's shown me what redemption actually looks like." "Margaret," I replied, "your willingness to face the truth and work toward healing has been part of God's plan for restoration. You've become an advocate for the very families you harmed. That's not just justice, that's grace." She smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression I had seen from her since her confession. "I'm starting a support group next month for healthcare workers dealing with ethical dilemmas. I want to make sure no one else goes through what I did, thinking they can fix the world's problems by taking matters into their own hands." As the reception concluded and families began to leave, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Webb, who had become a regular attendee at our services since the investigation began. "Father," she said, "the protocols we've implemented at Mercy General, based on what we learned from this case, are being adopted by hospitals across the state. Margaret's detailed records, as painful as they were to discover, have helped us create safeguards that should prevent anything like this from happening again." Later that evening, I sat in my study, reviewing the year that had transformed our parish. The legal proceedings were complete, the families had found their equilibrium, the hospital had reformed its procedures. But more than these practical resolutions, something deeper had occurred. Our community had been forced to grapple with fundamental questions about identity, belonging, and forgiveness. In the process, we had discovered that love is not a finite resource that gets diminished when shared more widely. Instead, we had watched families expand their capacity for love, children thrive with multiple sources of support, and a community grow stronger through shared vulnerability. Timothy O'Brien now had 6 adults who attended his school events and celebrated his achievements. Miguel Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson had gained brothers they never knew they needed. The Henderson family had found the biological son they had grieved for years while maintaining their devotion to their adopted daughters. Even the families who had struggled most with the revelations had eventually found ways to honor both their biological connections and the relationships built through years of daily love and care. As I prepared for bed that night, I offered a prayer of gratitude for the year behind us and the strength our community had found in its darkest hour. "Lord," I prayed, "you took what was meant for evil and transformed it into unexpected good. You showed us that families are built on love as much as biology, that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that your grace is sufficient for every crisis we face." Looking back, I could see how every element of our trial had been necessary for our growth. Margaret's confession had forced me to wrestle with the true meaning of pastoral duty. The family's crisis had revealed reserves of love and resilience none of us knew we possessed. The community's response had demonstrated that unity can emerge from diversity when people choose grace over grievance. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy our parish had instead become the foundation for deeper relationships, stronger faith, and a more profound understanding of what it means to be family. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I smiled at the thought of next Sunday's service, when all these beautiful, complicated, expanded families would gather once again to worship together. We had learned that God's love is big enough to hold all our questions, strong enough to bear all our pain, and creative enough to build beauty from the fragments of our broken expectations. In the end, that may be the greatest miracle of all, not that we avoided suffering, but that we found grace sufficient to transform our suffering into wisdom, our wounds into compassion, and our crisis into deeper community. The sacred burden I had carried for so long had become a gift, not just to me, but to everyone whose life had been touched by this extraordinary year of learning what family truly means.